experience or what you remember.
This is at Gilman Hot Springs.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I was at Gilman, and Gilman Hot Springs was a several 100-acre resort and golf course. And when I first went there, I was in the RPF. And the RPF had the job of renovating a house for Hubbard. And it was the only real decent structure on the property at that time. And I spent a number of months working on that project in the RPF. Then I got out of the RPF and was assigned to Hubbard's household unit. First of all, I was the purchaser for that project, and then I became the deputy commanding officer of the household unit. So in that position, I was responsible for all of the other people who were in his household unit. And that included the L. Ron Hubbard steward, the L. Ron Hubbard gear in charge, and that's the person who is responsible for his personal effects. There was the L. Ron Hubbard, I'm not sure what it was called, but he had chickens and farm, things like that. So there were people who took care of grounds, so the grounds around his house. And then at the beginning of 1980, during that time, Hubbard came to the property, not that often, but a few times. He was living a few miles away in Hemet at a secret location. And he came when I was involved. I think it was always in darkness. He came at night. He came in a blacked out van, and I was responsible for his security. So I opened the gate or let down the chain to allow the vehicle onto the property, and then would meet him, and he would go into his house or somewhere on the property. He met with his wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, at the time, and she had been charged with federal crimes at that time and was dealing with those charges. This is a result of the FBI raid in 1977. So in the 1979 period, she was still dealing with that. She was living in Los Angeles, so for Hubbard's security, they had to meet in secret, so I was largely responsible for those secret meetings, getting them together. So I only saw him a few times. We spoke, I think only spoke once, or I remember at least the last time that we spoke, and he just said, "Hello, Gerry, you look natural," something like that. And that's really my last contact with him was. Right. So in January of 1980, there was a threat of a raid at Gilman Hot Springs, and there had been a series of these raid threats ever since the FBI raid, the actual FBI raid in 1977. And each time there was a threat of a raid, the people had, Sea Org members at Hubbard's base, first La Quinta, then in Gilman Hot Springs. We had to destroy any evidence which would implicate Hubbard or which would be evidence of crimes of various kinds. So in this particular occasion, we were ordered to destroy any evidence that Hubbard intended to live at the property, that Hubbard controlled organization finance, that he was issuing orders into the Gilman Hot Springs property or to anyone in Scientology. So one of my juniors, the L. Ron Hubbard gear in charge, came to me with this beaten up old box of very early material and asked, should this be shredded? I took a look at it and determined that this predated anything to do with the Gilman Hot Springs property, so therefore it did not fit those various criteria, and plus this stuff had historical value and collector's value, and so should be saved. So then I went and determined that there was some 20 more boxes of this material, and this was stuff which had followed Hubbard around in his various places where he had lived, but people had not known about it. He perhaps had lost track of it, so it was this great discovery, and I petitioned him again in early January 1980 to assemble this material and to do the research for his biography. He granted my petition, so then I transferred from his household unit into what's called the L. Ron Hubbard Personal Public Relations Office, and undertook the task of doing the research for his biography and assembling this historical material which would form the basis of an L. Ron Hubbard library or an L. Ron Hubbard museum. So he granted the petition, as I said, and I proceeded to do that over the next 2 years. So I took those boxes, I moved them to the Personal Public Relations Office, and then because, again, of raid threats, we moved to the Big Blue building in Los Angeles. That's a big Sea Organization building, and we did that because it was considered that our little unit could get lost among the hundreds of Sea Org members that were there, and it would never be suspected by the FBI or by law enforcement or by anyone that we were there, and that the focus would be on the Gilman Hot Springs property, but we wouldn't be there, we would be in Los Angeles. So for most of the rest of the time in the Sea Org, I was not at Gilman, but I was at in the Los Angeles complex. And I traveled around to various places, interviewing people who had known him. I lined up interviews for other people to do, and I collected up whatever early material I could find. I traveled to various places that he had been. I did research in offices, and I purchased on behalf of the organization collections of early Hubbard material that people had, that they themselves had collected, so we purchased that. And that formed the L. Ron Hubbard Archive. In October 1980, Hubbard's attorney that I was working with at the time constructed a contract between the organization and an outside writer by the name of Omar Garrison. And I worked very closely with Garrison until I finally left in December of 1981, and I became his research assistant on the L. Ron Hubbard biography. So I was still a Sea Org member and still working for Hubbard, but by the contract I was also the assistant assigned to Omar Garrison. So I worked with him and traveled around to a number of places with him, helping him with research, and I provided him with the material that I had discovered, the material as it came in, and I was able to copy it and assemble it into a workable system. Up to then, it was just random paper, but I copied it and assembled it in binders that he could use, and really did that until I left. okay, Gerard Ryan could not possibly know what goes on in other parts of Scientology. He's here in a mission in Dublin, and he's not Sea Org that I know of. And even if he is, he was not where I was in the Sea Organization. I saw many people locked up. I myself was locked up. If someone in my position in the organization wanted to leave, was making plans to leave, or if someone thought they wanted to leave, they would be locked up and they would be security checked, and they would not be allowed to leave until they had been neutralized. So there was no way that they would have allowed me to leave if I'd said I wanted to leave. They would have locked me up. And they would have isolated me from my wife. They would have operated on both of us to turn each other against the other. They would have subjected us to sec checks, which would have gone on forever. And in my mental state at that time, the way that I viewed Hubbard in the organization, I would have fought them. I would have fought them physically, and I would have fought them to the death. And I believe that they would have killed me. So I really had no choice but to escape. And my wife and I we had very few personal effects. Most Sea Org members have very few personal property, very little personal property. And so bit by bit, we got it off the property, and then we cleaned our room and left our Sea Org uniforms there, and then just took off. And fortunately, I had borrowed one of the vehicles that Omar Garrison had. He knew we were leaving. He understood. He accepted it. He encouraged it, and he helped us escape. Gave us a vehicle, and we went from the organization up to Cedar City, Utah, where he had a home, and then we proceeded up to British Columbia. This is in December of 1981. I don't know of anyone who was killed like that, although now there is obviously Lisa McPherson. She wanted to leave. She was brought back. She was detained, and she was killed. So we know that that can happen because it happened to Lisa McPherson. I don't know of anyone else who was in my situation where they were willing to fight, or whose escape was unsuccessful and they were detained and then fought. I know lots of people who were locked up. When I say neutralized, I mean that they would be stripped of all of their Scientology materials, if they owned it, if they actually owned and had purchased Scientology materials. Those were stripped, robbed from them, so no one could leave with any of their personal materials like that. They were, as I say, subjected to sec checks, and they would not be allowed to leave until they had signed confessions. So material crimes or things that were embarrassing would be extracted, culled from their auditing files or from these sec checks. These things would be written into a declaration that a person must sign, so a confession of their crimes, and they could not leave until they'd signed that. So that is a huge factor in neutralizing someone, preventing them from ever speaking out if they've signed a list of their crimes. So there are a number of things that are done. Just the fact of isolation is enough to neutralize someone, strip away all their power, all their identity.